I'm very, very happy to see you. It's been a rough week weather-wise, so I'm very, very grateful that some of you are here. I'm Maxim Schreier, and I direct the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center. It's a project that we launched back in the fall, so it's in its second semester, and today's event is the second in our spring series of events, and we have a flyer that I think most of you have copies of. Help yourself to more copies. We're going to have two more events this spring. One will be a lecture by Ellen Dea Crawford-Tisley about Joseph Brodsky, and another will be a talk by Patricia Herlihy about the Jews of Odessa. And I'm very, very happy to welcome tonight's speakers, this afternoon's speakers, Professor Stefano Garzonio and Professor Stanley Rabinovitz. I'm going to introduce them both, then Professor Garzonio will present his talk, and then Professor Rabinovitz will respond, then we'll open the floor to questions. That's the order. And also I should thank, as I always do, our sponsors. The whole project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry is sponsored by a grant from Genesis Philanthropy Group, and also co-sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies here at Harvard. Dr. Stefano Garzonio is a professor of Slavic Studies at Pisa University in Italy, and one of Italy's most distinguished Slavists. Some of you may know that Italy has a very strong, a long-standing tradition of Russian and Slavic studies, and most Italian universities have very strong departments for a number of reasons, some of which go back to the history of left-wing politics in Italy, but Italy is a great place to do Russian studies and also to do Jewish studies. Professor Garzonio, in 1999-2009, served as president of the Italian Association of Slavists, and he presently serves as vice president of the executive committee of the International Council for Central and East European Study. Garzonio is the author of numerous books, articles, and other publications in several fields that include the theory and history of Russian verse, Russian literature of the 18th century, poetry of the Silver Age, and the history of Russian emigration in the 20th century. He is the editor of the comprehensive anthology Poesia Russa, published in 2004, and also, and this is really a remarkable fact, he recently published in Moscow a collection of verse that he wrote in Russian. And I think it's about to get reviewed, and I had the pleasure of reading it in manuscript, and I think it's a real achievement. Stefano Garzonio translated and annotated works by a number of Russian writers, including Lermontov, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Mayakovsky, Georgy Ivanov, and others. And as you know, the topic of Professor Garzonio's talk is Russian Jews in Italy, a topic that is chronically understudied, and I'm really looking forward to his comments. We're also very, very pleased to have with us Professor Stanley Rabinovitz, who is Henry Steele Commager Professor at Amherst College, where he founded the Amherst Center for Russian Culture, a longtime associate of the Davis Center, an expert on 20th century Russian literature and culture, and a literary translator. Professor Rabinovitz is the author of numerous publications, including the books Sologub's Literary Children, The Noise of Change, Epic and the Russian Novel, From Gogol to Pasternak. He collected, edited, and translated a volume of Akim Valinsky's selected writings on dance, ballets, magic, kingdom. Stanley, thank you. We really appreciate your being with us. And now, without further ado, please help me welcome Professor Stefano Garzonio, who is here to tell us about the Russian Jews in Italy and their legacy.
I'm very happy to be here. Many thanks for, I want to express my gratitude for inviting here to the Davis Center for Jewish and Eurasian Studies and for giving me such a wonderful opportunity. My lecture, my talk will be about Russian Jews in Italy, past and present. I will try to show also some pictures. Tracing a short history of the presence of Russian Jews in Italy during the first decades of the 20th century means to pay attention at the same time to the history of the late Hebraism in Italy, on one hand, and to the destinies of Jewish diaspora from the Russian Empire on the other. From this perspective, it could be useful to start our review with some cases concerning the second half of the 19th century. Here, I mean the presence and the activity in Italy of several representatives of the revolutionary movement against Tsarism, belonging to various anarchist and narodnik groups. I'd like to remind you, for instance, of the well-known geographer and sociologist Lev Miechnikov, who joined Garibaldi's 1000 and fell injured at the battle on the Volturno River in 1860. Something is what? Oh, perhaps.
It's always with pictures.
Okay. Lev Miechnikov was the brother of the famous biologist Ilya Miechnikov and the nephew of the writer and publicist Leib Navakovich, one of the founders of Russian Jewish literature. Recently, Miechnikov's memoirs about his stay in Italy were republished. They give a very impressive view of the most relevant phases of the Italian Risorgimento. Later, Miechnikov lived in Siena and Florence before taking part in the Paris Commune and then immigrating to Switzerland. Another Russian Jewish social activist who took part in Italian political life was the famous revolutionary, anarchist and feminist Anna Kulishov, Rosenstein. Coming from a Jewish family of Simferopol, her father was a merchant. In 1872, she was one of the first women admitted to the Polytechnic Institute of Zurich. In Switzerland, she became acquainted with the anarchist ideas of Bakunin, and when she returned to Russia, she joined a well-known movement of intellectuals who saw themselves as going to the people, the group of Tchaikovsky and then Buntari. In 1876, she returned back to Switzerland, and a year later, she left Russia forever. In this time, she met Andrea Costa, an important representative of Italian anarchism and socialism, and she soon settled in Italy. She would be imprisoned in Florence and freed after a famous trial. From this moment, she would take an active part in the Italian political struggle. Later, she became the editor of the socialist review Critica Sociale, playing a decisive role in the politics of Italian socialists alongside Filippo Turati, preferring a reformist position and opposing communism and fascism as well. Another Russian Jewish woman who had a significant role in Italian political life and also made an important contribution to the international socialist movement was Angelica Balabanov. She studied in Belgium, then moved to Italy and joined the Socialist Party after having become acquainted with Labriola, Turati and Mussolini. She is told to be, for several months, the lover of Mussolini as well. After the October Revolution, she joined the Bolshevik Party and served as secretary of the Comintern. She was soon disillusioned and returned to Italy. With the rise of fascism, however, she emigrated to Switzerland and later the United States. After the Second World War, she returned to Italy, joined the Social Democratic Party, and continued her political career until her death. Another category of Russian Jews who came to Italy in the 19th century was related to the sciences. Here I'd like to recall the case of the Jewish Odysseit Marco or Mark Waldtuch, one of the earlier translators of Pushkin into Italian. His translations were printed in Odessa in 1855. His psychography earned him a significant role in the philosophical debate in Italy about and against Lombroso's theories. We have data confirming Waldtuch's relationships with the Jewish milieu in Italy, especially with Jewish diaspora in Lahore or Livorno, as you prefer. This is a pressing question as the inter-Jewish connections between Italian and Russian Jews in the 19th century have not been sufficiently studied yet. As far as natural sciences are concerned, it is worth reminding that in 1873, a zoological station was founded in Naples. Among the Russian specialists working at the station, there were many Jewish scientists. About this theme, there is a book was published some years ago in Moscow by a specialist, a biologist from Petersburg. His name is Fokin. This is where I'd like to recall the brother of Lev Mechnikov, the famous biologist and pioneer of immunology, later Nobel Prize winner Ilya Mechnikov, and the pathophysiologist Efim London. It is very probable that both men maintained relationships with the local Jewish milieu in Naples and in South Italy. Already in the first decade of the 20th century, there were several Jewish Russian medical doctors who carried out their profession in Italy. They were usually linked to the revolutionary milieu and lived on the Ligurian coast. Here I mean, for instance, the wife of Georgy Plikhanov, Rosalia Bograd, Viktor Magdelberg, and Abram Zalmanov, who in 1918 became the doctor of Vladimir Lenin and later emigrated to France. The above-mentioned Anna Kulishov worked as a doctor in the populous suburbs of Milan. At the end of the 19th century, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, after the Russian Revolution of 1905, it is possible to identify the following categories of Russian Jews choosing Italy as a refuge or a new country of settlement. These include revolutionaries, students, press correspondents, journalists, Zionists, musicians, and artists. It is important to underscore that at the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish Russian refugees and émigrés had good reasons to choose Italy. The government of Giovanni Giolitti offered democratic and constitutional protections for foreigners. This situation was sustained by the presence of a strong socialist party and by liberal public opinion. It is also worth mentioning the cultural and political relevance of the Jewish community in Italy, especially in large cities such as Rome, Milan, Florence, Naples, but also, for instance, in smaller cities like Lahore. Last but not least, education in Italian university was quite accessible to young students from Russia, though this trend became less pronounced before the important migration flows from the Russian Empire after the Russian Revolution. To best illustrate the Italian attitude toward political émigrés from Russia, is appropriate to recall the famous Gotz affair. Mikhail Raphaelovich Gotz was a Russian revolutionary, a member of Narodnaya Volya, and one of the founders of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, SRI. For his revolutionary activity, he was sentenced to katorga, or forced hard labor, in Siberia. After the 1895 amnesty, he emigrated to France and later to Italy. In 1901, the Russian government demanded Gotz's extradition from Italy. He was suspected of being involved in the murder of Ministry of the Interior Sipiagin. There was general support for the Jewish revolutionary within Italian cultural and political circles. Riccardo Luzzato, a member of parliament, a Garibaldi's follower and an Italian Jew, is reported to have said that if England or Switzerland didn't host Mazzini and Garibaldi, no Italian risorgimento would have been possible. After a long and violent debate, the extradition was denied. This led to a diplomatic crisis and to the cancellation of the Tsar's proposed visit to Italy. At the same time, this demonstrated that Italy was a good shelter for Russian revolutionaries. There is another Russian Jew who had a very close relationship with Italy and its political and cultural life. Here I mean Vladimir Zhabotinsky, who played many different roles during his time in Italy as a Jewish student at Italian University, a newspaper correspondent, and a Zionist political activist. Zhabotinsky, writer and journalist, Zionist leader, ideologue and founder of the revisionist movement in Zionism, arrived in Rome in fall 1898 as a correspondent of Одесский Листок and then later Одесские Новости. He was a student at the University of Rome and had contacts with political theorists such as Antonio Labriola, Enrico Ferri, and others. He published articles in Italian in the socialist paper L'Avanti, as well as other journals, and took an active part in political and ideological debates in Italy at the time. His correspondence from Rome gave an impressive view of Italian life and the political struggles of the beginning of the century, while his novel and tales tried to follow the best traditions of Russian prose in the late realistic canon. Here, there is not enough time to describe all of the interesting ways in which Zhabotinsky is connected to Italy, which he visited several times. As a leader of the revisionist Zionist movement in the 20s, Zhabotinsky became acquainted with Italian fascism. The so-called Raggruppamento d'Italia was founded in 1925, and its ideologue, Leone Carpi, chief of the revisionist Zionist youth movement Betar, supported a clear anti-British position. In 1935, a Jewish naval training school was established in Civitavecchia by Zhabotinsky's movement. Jewish cadets supported Italy during the Second Italo-Abyssinian War. The academy trained cadets from many countries. Another representative of Zionism was Pinkas Rutenberg, who lived in Italy from 1907 to 1915. Rutenberg was a well-known social revolutionary who organized the execution, for collaboration with the Tsarist police, of Russian Orthodox priest and social reformer Georgy Gapon, and later created in Italy the Society Pro Causa Ebraica. The Russian diaspora, after the revolution 1905, was concentrated in the main cities of the country: Rome, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and Naples. where there were Russian communities before, already in the 19th century. A very important presence of Russian émigrés was detectable on the Ligurian coastline and at Capri after the arrival of Maxim Gorky in 1906. Among the many Russian refugees and migrants, writers, journalists, artists, and many members of revolutionary parties and groups, there were many Jews. Some of them returned to Russia after the amnesty of 1913. Most of them came back to Italy after the Revolution of October. In 1913, the first Congress of Russian Society in Italy, Rome, Naples, Capri, Nervi, is not far from Genoa, and Milan, was organized in Rome. Many of the delegates were Jewish, and many of them played a significant political role. Among them, there was Grigory Schrader, an economist and member of the Social Revolutionary Party, who in 1917 was elected Petersburg city chairman. In the archives of several Italian universities, it is possible to find documentation pertaining to Jewish students who choose Italy for their studies, as strict quotas for Jewish students were enforced in the Russian Empire. Jewish students enrolled in Padua, Rome, Florence, Milan, and other universities. For instance, I studied the documents concerning several students enrolled at Pisa University. In the second part of my lecture, I will speak about the biography of one of them, an example of a Russian Jew who could completely integrate into Italian society. Like Zhabotinsky, Mark Slonim was an important representative of cultural and political engagement in Russia and then in Russian immigration, who has and he also studied in Italy. He was a student of philology at Florence University in 1913-14 and published an Italian translation of Turgenev's Senilia, Стихотворение в прозе. Afterwards, he spent the years from 1990 to 1922 in Florence, becoming a regular contributor to the leftist daily Il Secolo. He published the following items in Italian: Spartaco and Bellacun, and two memoirs, Russian Revolution and Bolshevism seen by a Russian. Another student, Anatol Geller, also was a student at the University of Florence. Later, under the pseudonym of Antonio Chiarini, Geller would play an important role during the split of the Italian Socialist Party and the foundation of the Italian Communist Party in Livorno in 1921. So a Jew who gave an important contribution to the birth of the Communist Party in Italy. It is interesting to notice that many emissaries of the Bolsheviks and of Comintern in Italy were Jewish. For instance, Nikolai Lyubarsky, Aaron Wisner, and Nathan Greenfeld. The last a collaborator of the revolutionary leader Georgy Chicherin, later a personality of Soviet cinema. They both were later, the first two, Nikolai Lyubarsky and Aaron Wisner, were later victims of Stalin's repression, as was Mark Scheftel. You see here his photography, a young revolutionary who studied in Genoa. He became a well-known medical doctor, collaborated with Chicherin on political propaganda among Russian students in Italy, and then became a representative of the Red Cross. With Vsevolod Shebedev and Konstantin Ketov. The latter, Ketov, was a Volga German whose real name was Ivan Kreinert and who was involved in young years in terroristic acts in Saratov. Scheftel was the person in charge of the Rome Committee of Aid to Russian Émigrés. He later joined the Bolsheviks and in 1924 returned to the USSR. Other Jewish Russian emissaries of the Comintern who had a sizable role in the political line of Partito Comunista Italiano were Daniel Riedel and Vladimir Diogot. So many representatives of communism who lived for several times, several years in Italy. Other notable Jewish Russian students were, on the other side, Rosa Ginsberg Astorgina, the daughter of the well-known Jewish philosopher and author Ahad Ha'am, later wife of the writer Mikhail Asargin, who was a student of law at the University of Rome. Or, for example, Leah Kremer, Isabella, who later became a singer and poet and studied in Milan with Maestro Luigi Ronzi. At the moment, a general list of Jewish Russian students at Italian University is not available, but several recent works devote attention to this question. Many Jews who were Russian press correspondents were associated with political activists and students. Very often, in fact, they were revolutionaries, émigrés, or students at the same time. As we saw, Zhabotinsky and Slonim were also journalists and publicists. I would like to turn your attention now to another very interesting figure of the time, the journalist Samuil Pevsner, a student of St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music, who fled Russia during the 1899 students' uprising, and after a short period in the United States, arrived in Italy in 1906. He was close to the socialist revolutionaries and found a job as a correspondent for the Moscow daily Ranne Utra, early morning. In 1914-15, he was the secretary of the Russian Society in Rome, and then he departed to the United States as a correspondent for the daily paper Russkaya Volya. After February 1917, he returned to Russia. Eventually, he found employment at the press office of Narkomindal, and in 1925 returned to Italy with his family as the chief of the press office of a Soviet embassy in Rome. You see, a lot of change in his life. In 1928, he refused to go back to the USSR and became a невозвращенец. He settled in Milan and collaborated with the émigrés daily Последние новости. During this period, he published a book devoted to Evno Azef and the history of Russian terrorism. After the introduction of the racial laws by Mussolini in 1938, he was forced to leave Italy and emigrate to the United States, where he collaborated with Novoe Ruskoye Slovo and taught Russian at the Pentagon. So from communism to Pentagon. Very. Just a moment. Okay. As we saw, the composition of the Jewish diaspora from the Russian Empire to Italy was quite varied and had a significant impact on Italian society and history. There were also many Jewish Russians involved in arts, music, literature, and theater, but unfortunately we cannot look into this aspect in greater depth. But I'd like to mention, however, that many artists and literary figures visited Maxim Gorky first on Capri and then in Sorrento in the 20s. The artists who came to Italy in order to study fine arts or music included, for example, the well-known sculptor Yankel Katz, the poet and translator Raisa Grigorievna Alkienitskaya, the famous actress Tatiana Pavlova, Zeitman, and many others. So we have many representative of hearts between the Jewish diaspora from Russia in Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. Now I'd like to concentrate our attention on two different émigrés whose contribution to literature demonstrate the role of that Russian Jews played in Italian culture. I mean the writer Osip Blinderman, pseudonym Osip Félyne, and the translator and critic Leone Ginsburg. Here we have figures of different generations and backgrounds. Osip Blinderman, a Jew from Odessa, started his literary career in Russia, publishing tales and novels in literary Tolstoy Journali, or the so-called fat monthly reviews. A short novel course, Prokletye, devoted to a pogrom and anticipating the story of My Dovecote by Isaac Babel, was prohibited by the censor for its violence and descriptions of cruelty. Blinderman studies abroad, in Switzerland and in France, and became an aeronautical engineer. Afterwards, he lived in Italy, where he began to publish his novels, tales, and plays from 1919 onwards. His earlier works were first translated into Italian by Italian specialists in Slavic studies, such as Federico Verdenois. He was a writer, a realist writer living in Naples, and who was a friend of Gorky, or Ettore Logato, who was the founder of Italian Slavistic studies. But later, Blinderman, or Félyne, translated his prose into Italian by himself. He worked with his wife, Lia Neanova. The real name was Fanny Rosenberg, and soon their daughter, Iris. Félyne became a well-known Italian playwright. He published in the famous journal Commedia, and later he became the director of the popular theater magazine Il Teatro per Tutti, the theater for all. His pieces were staged by famous Italian theatrical troupes, such as those of Emma Grammatica, Ettore Petrolini, and Rezzo Ricci. Was the most important Italian actors during the 20s and the 30s. At the same time, the prose of Félyne was well received by Italian critics and readers. His novel, such as Il bivio in due con l'ombra, and these books of short stories, such as Il silenzio dei colori or Bagliori sull'abisso, were positively reviewed by Italian critics and writers, for instance by Luciano Zuccoli or Umberto Fracchia. In 1929-1930, Félyne was invited by the editor Corbaccio in Milan to supervise a new series of translation of Russian literature named Volga. In the period between the two world wars, Félyne was able to find a place in the history of Italian literature. For example, he was acquainted with the Bontempelli and other well-known writers of this period. Félyne's prose was elegant and bright and perfectly suited for the apolitical and nostalgic atmosphere of the 1930s Italian literature, or so we call, if we speak about cinema, for example, the so-called cinema of the telefoni bianchi, or the white telephones. It was the fashion during the 30s and the beginning of the 40s. As other Russian Jews, Félyne was stripped of his Italian citizenship after the Russian laws of 1938. He continued to live in Italy, however, and died in Bordighera in 1950. His theatrical reduction of Dostoevsky's Insulted and Humiliated achieved a great success after his death as a television series produced by Italian television in 1958. This is the first example of Russian writer who started writing in Italian language. Now about Leone Ginsburg, whose destiny was very different. Ginsburg played a very important role in establishing a new intellectual and literary culture in the democratic Italy after the war, but could not see it survive the war, as he was barbarically killed by the Gestapo in the last days of the occupation of Rome. Ginsburg was one of the most innovative and original translators and interpreters of Russian literature at the time, and made an important contribution to the development of well-known publishing house Einaudi in Turin. So many Italian writers were linked were supported by Leone Ginsburg. For example, I think about Italo Calvino, Pavese, and so on. His collection of essays Scrittori Russi, which was published posthumously, is a foundational text for Italian Slavic studies. His wife, Natalia Ginsburg, was one of the most celebrated Italian writers of the second post-war period. At the end of this long review, I'd like to concentrate my attention. I'd like to concentrate my attention on two local cases, because we spoke about a very important representative of politics, literature, and so on. Now, two local cases, which I consider quite useful for demonstrating many sociological and cultural characteristics of Russian Jews in Italy. Here I mean the example of Sigmund or Sigismondo Ionasson and of Naphtali London, or Yemdin as it in Italy was called. Sigmund Ionasson, born in Smolensk, came to Italy in 1907, as many others, as a representative as a revolutionary, and initially settled in Genoa, where he participated in political activities against the Tsar in Italy. His presence is noted in many documents of the time, and he was involved in the arrest of the whole edition of the social democratic paper Proletari. It was printed in Italy, it was printed in French, in Switzerland, but from Italy it was sent, they had to send it to Russia from Genoa. In Genoa, Ionasson found a job at the pharmacy Atri Oliva in the center of the town. In 1911, Ionasson settled in Pisa, where some years later he founded a perfume industry, Ionasson and Company, which obtained the exclusive patent for Italy of the famous Paris brands Frères Sauzet and Madelier Paris Beauté. Advertisements for his products were published on the page of the local weekly magazine L'Idea Fascista, the fascist idea, in 1923. Ionasson very soon joined the Fascist Party. The situation changed later with the declaration of autarkia, self-sufficiency policy by Mussolini, when the perfume industry was accused of loyalty to foreign powers. After the racial laws went into effect, Ionasson was forced to change the name of his enterprise to Medicea Industria Profumi Cosmetici Affini, and to transfer ownership to his son-in-law, an Italian official. During the this is some advertisement of products by Ionasson products. During the war, Ionasson hid in countryside not far from Pisa, probably with the help of the Pisan Archbishop Gabriele Vettori. The name of Sigismondo Ionasson is still well known in Pisa for having donated a famous crucifix by Giunta Pisano to the local fine arts museum San Matteo. To this day, it is still called Ionasson's Giunta. And perhaps this crucifixion gave Jonasson the opportunity to save himself, because he was supported not only by the church but by several exponents of fascism or moderate fascism in Tuscany. Now the last here we have the history of the crucifixion of Giunta Pisano, datable to the beginning of the 13th century, now in the Museo Nazionale di San Matteo in Pisa, to which it seems to have been donated sometimes in 1940. The donor who bought the work from the nuns of the convent of San Benedetto in Pisa, the previous owners of the painting, paying the substantial sum of, at the time, of 20,000 lire, was the Russian Jew Sigismondo Jonasson, resident since 1912 in Pisa, where he possessed a perfume factory, and so on. What you see here, there is the villa of Jonasson, where he organized a concert and he organized meetings with local musicians, local artists during the 30s and during the 30s. Before he was before the racial laws of 1938. Now I have got any photo, any photography portrait of the last one is Naphtali London. Naphtali London, the son of a dentist from Gomel in present-day Belarus, studied medicine and surgery at Pisa University before the war. He decided to immigrate to Italy after being refused admission to Moscow University. He renounced his Russian citizenship in 1926 and obtained an Italian passport in 1928. He served at the Institute of Legal Medicine of Pisa until October 1938, when he was expelled for his Jewish ancestry. It is interesting, however, that at the start of the 30s, he joined the Fascist Party and was an outspoken opponent of Bolshevism and maximalist socialism. Later, he became the president of a delegation of Jewish assistance, an organization which helped Italian Jews after the racial laws. After the war, he was elected as a representative of the Republican Party and became councillor for Elsie in the municipality of Pisa. And he is recalled today, and many people who knew him speak about with very large sympathy about him, who had a very important role in the life of the town after the war. As I have tried to show, the history of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire to Italy represents a very rich and multifaceted cultural phenomenon, which deserves further analysis. At the moment, we don't have sufficient evidence to determine the relationship between the Jewish communities in Italy and in Russia, though, of course, many details are available from the history of the making of the State of Israel, as in the case of Zhabotinsky and Rutenberg. And I think that a further examination of archives, especially in Israel, would lend itself to a more comprehensive account of this complicated subject, which concerns the history of Russia, of Italy, and of Israel at the same time. Many thanks for attention.
I have no pictures. You'll have to look at me. I think it's nice to be here. I actually should thank Maxime for inviting me, but I think he knew I'm Jewish, I speak Italian. Put those two together and ask him to be a respondent. It turns out I think I was also put in the wrong basket. The basket that I was put in should have arrived at Boston College tomorrow when Stefano is going to give a talk on Russian writers, émigré writers in Italy. My field is Russian literature. Instead, the basket is here. And this is not something that I ordinarily would be interested in, but it is nice to be here. I should say it's nice to be back here, because just a month ago, the Davis Center sponsored a talk by a writer named Alexandra Petrova. She is a poet who emigrated from Leningrad, Petersburg, via Israel to Italy in 1993, and she now lives in Rome. She spoke about her book, a very complicated book which has not yet been translated into English, called Appendix, which won the 2016 very prestigious Andre Bailey Prize. It's like a Bailey novel. It's very complicated and convoluted. This is a work of fiction which explores the experiences of migration, immigration, and emigration against the background of the Eternal City, where, of course, millions have arrived in the course of history from the world over. So maybe this is the year of Italy, and Harvard is, I don't know what, issuing a new edict that we will now spend more time thinking about and studying a topic which, Maxime, you said, and which has long been underappreciated and understudied. Professor Garzonio's project is not only exciting, but it is long overdue. Italy has always seemed to me to be a very poor second cousin in terms of interest and knowledge and scholarship when it concerns Russian émigrés and Jewish émigrés as well to Western Europe. France, Paris, Germany, Berlin, even Britain. But somehow Italy has remained on the margins. And so this would be nice. Of course, in the other cases, the numbers, I assume, are far greater. And I would love to know what the numbers here are. I guess you'd have to distinguish between people who are just passing through, people who get an education, people who stay and then leave, people who stay and live there forever. But that would be interesting. I want to talk a bit about, we shouldn't be surprised about this Italian-Russian interest and transfer of talent and energy from one country to another. After all, Moscow may still be called, but for years was called the Third Rome. And of course, the legend says, and a fourth there will not be. The Venice of the North, St. Petersburg, has encouraged a fair share of 20th century Russian intellectuals and artists to choose that city as their burying place. Diaghilev, Stravinsky, and most recently, Joseph Brodsky. Anyone, of course, who has studied Russian cultural history, particularly the history of Petersburg, cannot avoid noticing the significant persistence and numbers of Italian composers, choir masters, particularly in the late 18th, early 19th century, around Catherine the Great, Paul, even a little later. Every Russian, you go to Russia, Petersburg, these are household names. Rastrelli, Quarenghi, Rossi, the architects. The composer, not a bad composer, I think, Giovanni Paisiello wrote the first Barber of Seville. Rossini followed. Another fascinating composer, Cimarosa, wrote the Matrimonio Segreto. There's a long history of music. Verdi himself visited Petersburg. The premiere of his opera La Forza del Destino took place at the, it was not the Mariinsky then, it was the Bolshoi Theater in 1862. And of course, in the tradition of dance, the great ballerina Pierina Lignani, the great choreographer, ballet master he was called at the time, Enrico Cecchetti, all visited Petersburg and left their mark. I'm not going to talk about 20th century writers. Tomorrow I'm sure you will do it. Of course, the name that most comes to mind to me is the great writer Nikolai Gogol, who spent the better part of 6 years in Italy in Rome, where he fled in 1836, and where he reached the pinnacle of his fame. It was in Rome where he actually completed and wrote most of his great novel, Dead Souls. He called the city his spiritual home, and Italian his second language. Italy is mine, he wrote. No one can take her away from me. I was born here. Russia, Petersburg were but a dream. And so the ties between Italy and Russia and the presence of Italy in the Russian consciousness, I think is great and serves, at least I choose to have it serve, as the background for Stefano's wonderful paper. I would say at the outset, I think I mentioned this, of course we only have time for selected stars and figures of the Russian Jewish migration to presence in Italy. But as I said before, it would be nice to know how many Jews were there, how many Jews, native Jews, were living in the country, what were the relations between the Russian Jews who came and the Russians, non-Jewish, between the Russian Jews who came and the native Italians, and those Russian Jews amongst themselves. Nabokov writes in his memoirs that in the 1920s and 30s, he and other émigrés in the West had all the everyday conveniences that other West Europeans had. But for the most part, they lived in isolation, maintaining their own separate kind of lifestyle. Of course, he was speaking of his own experience in Berlin, partly in Paris, and then he must have known a bit about Prague because that's where his mother lived, and so he would visit her there. I wonder if this is true of the Italian experience. To what extent did these Russian Jewish émigrés live apart, create their own world? Of course, there are ways of finding out. That is to say, to what extent did the Russian Jews in Italy insist on preserving their cultural heritage and their sense of belonging to the Jewish or the Russian Jewish community that they were a part of? To what extent did they break out of that context and create something new? I think here we have the whole issue of acculturation and integration on the one hand, and, if you like, cultural continuity on the other. I want to concentrate and speak about two specific examples that I know of the Russian Jewish presence in Italy and the Italian-Russian Jewish emigration in general, which I think are pertinent, these two examples, to Professor Garzonio's paper. First is the rather extraordinary and hardly written about, as far as I know, Gogol Library in Rome. In Russian, it was known as the Ruskaya Biblioteka imeni N.V. Gogoля, Vremya. In Italian, Biblioteca Russa N.V. Gogol. This is really a fascinating institution, especially as it relates to Russian Jews who emigrated in the so-called third emigration in the 1970s and 80s. Ever since its founding in 1902, the Gogol Library has been a small island of free Russian culture. And it moved in 1907 to new headquarters, where it remained until 1969, and then, after several migrations and actually quite a scandal, it finally moved to its permanent home and became part, as far as I know, in 1998, of the permanent collection of the regional Lazio, is where Rome is, library system. It was thus nationalized and its existence was guaranteed. Why do I think it's such an important place? Well, first of all, it has over 15,000 volumes in Russian, 300 periodicals, and in the 1970s and 80s, I'm sure you all know this, those Russian Jews who chose the United States as their destination, most of all went through Rome and its environs. As a matter of fact, in the 1970s, in this very small library, as many as 40 readers a day appeared, and the library became, I wanted to say I would actually say the focal point. Indeed, it was almost overwhelmed by the growing numbers of Russian Jews who were in Rome and its environs, waiting for permission to come to the United States. I'd love to see a monograph or an article about this. By the way, another question is, how did Russians get into Italy? What was the procedure? Did you have to apply? I mean, we're dealing with refugees now. Was there a quota? Did you have to apply? What processes were in place to bring these Russian émigrés? Did they just cross the border? Did they need papers? That would also be fairly interesting. I'm particularly interested in the Gogol, or knowledgeable about it, and it's very limited because this Amherst Center for Russian Culture, which was founded by, he's now dead, this our patron Thomas Whitney, who was a translator, a collector of Russian art and books, was also a philanthropist, and he gave quite a bit of money to the library in Rome. And somewhere in the 80s, there was quite a scandal. The director on it was selling books, he was stealing books, and at that point, Mr. Whitney pulled out and had a very interesting correspondence, which is located in Amherst, with a woman named Irina Alberti. She was Italian but married a Russian working for Ruski Mysl. She was involved in the library. It is a fascinating story. The library, that is to say, I think was, I'll call it the central place where I think Russian Jews of the third emigration would confront or meet Russians of the first emigration, the white Russians. I mean, after all, you have to realize Russians and Russian Jews living in the Soviet Union did not have access to so much information. It was in, largely, not exclusively, the Gogol Library in Rome, where these Russian Jews would read about and learn about matters that were hidden from them while they were officially living in the Soviet Union. I worry because that generation of the third emigration is, of course, starting to die out. And I think it would be great to have, maybe we do, an oral history from them as to what they got in that library, what was there, how it affected their view of Russia and the West. I think this awaits its chronicler. By the way, the statistic I saw that in 1976, according to the Gogol Library's administrator, there were about 4,000 Russian Jewish émigrés in the area of Rome. The second example, which I'm most excited about, is the figure of Ugo Stile. I bet you Stefano hasn't heard. Maybe you have heard of him, have you? He was born, Mikhail Kamenetsky, in Moscow in 1919. He was the son of a dentist. He was the son of a very cultured immigrant, like Pasternak's mother, pianist, a bourgeois, very intellectual woman. The family emigrated in the early 20s, first to Naples, and then eventually to Rome. They must have lived a bit in Latvia because this Stile's younger sister was born in Riga. Ugo Stile was a pen name. His name, of course, was Kamenetsky. He became, in 1987, the very successful editor. As a matter of fact, he's considered to be the savior of the prominent and prestigious newspaper, which runs out of Milan, Corriere della Sera, a position which he gave up in 1992 when he returned to his old job, which was which was the reporter for Corriere della Sera, the correspondent in New York. And he died there in 1995. The reason I mention him is for those of us who don't know much about this topic and who really want a fascinating, if you love to read, this is the book, a fascinating book. The book was written in 2013 by his son, who also is a journalist, Alexander Stile. It's called The Force of Things, La Forza delle Cose, published in 2013. It is really, for me, a very gripping, very immediate, very moving account of just this topic, of a Russian Jewish family, somewhat middle upper class, who comes to Italy, settles there, and of course gets caught up in fascist Italy, particularly Ugo Stile, because he was inside. He was a journalist, he was writing for the newspaper, and knew quite a few influential people. Of course, eventually he was able to get out, and came to America, but then of course he rediscovered his Italian roots and started working for Il Corriere della Sera. I think, for me, if you read this book, alongside with Natalia Ginzburg's wonderful book published in English in the 60s called Family Sayings, Lessico Familiare, where she talks also about, particularly her husband at the end, Leone Ginzburg, about this period of repression against Jews. You get a very moving, as I say, immediate sense of what it was really like to live there as a Russian Jewish emigre. One thing I did, I happened to be in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I dropped into a place I'd never been to, and that's YIVO, and that is now on West 16th Street. And I just wanted to find out what kinds of documents, it's a huge, of course, archive, mostly dealing with the Holocaust. But I asked what kinds of folders would be available to me on Russian Jews living in Italy. And I didn't need much notice. You can get it in 40 minutes. You sit there and they bring you boxes. They said, well, we don't have much before the Holocaust, but we'll show you what we have. Well, you go into these boxes and a whole world, to me, opens up. For instance, there are lists of, it's very sad and very morbid to look at this, there are lists of Italian Jews, not from the largest cities, but from smaller cities, who were rounded up and deported eventually, and like Leone Ginzburg, eventually they were killed. What is fascinating, though, for me, was it's not only their names, it's their occupations. These are like church registers, where they were born, quite a few from Odessa, quite a few from Belarus, what their profession was. You get an overall picture of the kind of, the population in Italy at the time of Russian Jews, as well as the native Jews who lived in Italy. So this is what I offer. I have some questions which may come out during the question period, but I found this a wonderful opportunity for me to learn much more about something which has been out there, but which I never quite grasped specifically. So thank you very much for this paper. That's it.
Yes, it was very interesting what you told. For example, the history of the Russian library in Rome was very, very, I would say, very strange, because on one hand, it is true there are several representatives of Russian Jews, and on the other, the library was directed by a man who was a representative of Russian nationalism, Evgeny Vagin. And then Wagner was a representative of Russian nationalism in the 50s, and then he became a dissident. I would say, of right, a right dissident in Russia, and he was expelled from Russia. He was exiled, and he lived in Italy, and they tried to transfer all the library to Germany. There was a project and an operation for transferring from all the library to Germany, and it was stopped at the end by several Italian Slavists. For example, Carlo Riccio, who was a Russian. Her mother was from Ackermann. She was Russian, and so Michele Colucci, Riccardo Picchio, and some other else who tried to stop this operation. But what is very interesting is to underline the relationship between the Russian Jews in Italy and the old Russian immigration, white immigration. What is especially in the Russian diaspora in Italy is that there was a very long tradition of people leaving Russia at the beginning of the 19th century or during the 19th century, and living in Rome or Florence. For example, Buturlini was the family of Demidov and some others. And in Rome there was a very strong relationship between the Russian white representative and the nobility, the Roman nobility. And now there are several archives, family archives of Roman nobilities in Rome, where it would be possible to find a very interesting documents about Russian and the Russian immigration, but unfortunately these archives are still closed. What else? The case of Stille is the case of many others, representative. For example, the family of Maffei was another example. Was an artist, and the mother was from Russian Jews, and so on. There are several different destiny of these Jews, Russian refugee or emigrated. And as you told, I think that very well is the situation of Jewish families in Italy is described by Natalia Ginsburg in her novel Lessico Familiare. On the other hand, there was another very important Jewish writer, Italian writer, Primo Levi, who was not from Russia. His family was from Poland, but no. At the same time, what I present today, it was not the Russian immigration, but the immigration from the Russian Empire. Yeah. There are, for example, there were several Jewish Russian came from Lithuania, from the Baltic, from Ukraine, and so on. And eventually, it's very interesting. Another fact that after the revolution, several representatives of Italian Jews who lived in Odessa or in other part of South Russian Empire, for example, Kerch and so on, they came back to Italy after 2 or 3 generations, and so there was the return of Italian Jews from Russia to Italy after the revolution. And for example, and now there exist several organizations in Kerch or in other parts of the Crimea of Italian emigrated refugees, and they are now, for example, in Italy now there are several exhibitions devoted to this theme. Of course, most of them are Italian who lived. Garibaldi also went to Odessa. Then he decided to come back to organize the liberation of Italy, of South Italy. Most of them were, of course, Italian who emigrated to the Russian Empire, but there was a lot of Italian Jews who lived, who went from Italy to Russia and then back to Italy. And from this point of view, I think it would be very interesting to study the archives of Italian synagogues, because at the moment there are several project linked, for example, with I know very well what are my colleagues doing in Pisa or Livorno, where there was and there are very important Jewish tradition. They are studying the tradition of the Jewish tradition in these cities, these towns, and they studied in the archives of the synagogue, and so a lot of work is ahead, and we have to continue in this direction.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to move back. We have luckily some time for questions. I just want to thank Stefano and Stanley. I truly enjoyed this event. I just want to make 2 quick comments following up on something Stefano said and something Stanley said. The first is the case of Russian Jews who became Italian writers. It's a very important case, and for various reasons that don't make a whole lot of sense, it's a lot less known than the case of Jews from Russia who became major French language writers in their interwar and post-war period. We all know of Lsat, of Nathalie, and we know a lot less even about Leone and some of the writers that Stefano mentioned, and that's really a lacuna.
I don't mention, for example, Gobetti, who is very important because he had a Russian friend, and so, and other writers, Italian writers who have contact with Russian Jews.
Right, and also these writers were not just contributors to Italian culture, they were conduits, they were bridges between Russian and Soviet culture and Italian letters. In a sense, it's a similar situation as the case of, say, Lsat or Andrei Troya, who wasn't Jewish, he was of Armenian Russian descent. They were also interpreters of Russian and Soviet letters.
I would to add some another very, I think, interesting details. The interest about Russian literature at the beginning of the century was linked, of course, to the immigration from Russia, and especially from Russia, by Jews. And it is interesting to underline that also this is concerned not only the democratic and liberal culture, but also the culture of the Italian right and the culture of Italian fascism. There is a very interesting case. There is a translation of the 12 of Bloch made by a Jew, Baumstein, and another person, Telesio Interlandi, who after 20 years will be the theoric of the Italian race, and he will publish a journal whose title is La Razza, the race. So it's very interesting to see how the interconnection between the Russian and Jewish culture after the revolution and in the first years of fascism era. And to see that there was really a big interest, about this.
That's great. And so, and the second brief point is that something Stanley brought up, that in the years that immediately followed the Shoah and World War II, Italy essentially opened itself to tens of thousands of survivors of the Shoah, Jewish refugees, many of whom were Eastern European Jews, Polish Jews, Hungarian, Romanian Jews, some were Russian Jews, and they were in Italy in the early 1940s into the early 1950s, and many of them sailed from the ports of Italy for Israel, or before Israel became Israel, the British Mandate. And that tradition was resurrected, so that's, Stanley, something you mentioned, in the early 1970s when Jews from the Soviet Union began to emigrate. Most of them emigrated legally, as you know, with Israeli visas. They came to Vienna, and then those who did not go to Israel ended up in Italy. Why Italy? This is something I have a lot to say about, but Stefano also has a great deal to say about it. In fact, he has written recently about the experience of Soviet Jews in Italy. Maybe next year we'll bring him back to speak about that. But basically, there were no special documents. That's the paradox of it. You arrived in Vienna with a Soviet exit visa, which you received a stamp in the Dutch embassy, because the Netherlands represented the interests of Israel in the Soviet Union, the absence of diplomatic relations, which the Soviet Union broke off after the victory of Israel in this in the Six-Day War in 1967. So essentially, you had a Soviet exit visa and an Israeli stamp that you got in the Dutch embassy. You arrived with that in Vienna, and then you usually took an overnight train into Rome, but you had no visa to Italy. That's the paradox of this. So in a sense, the same way as right after World War II and the Shoah, the Italian government really very kindly looked the other way and allowed Jewish organizations to bring Jewish refugees to Italy and gave them shelter and gave them haven. And so that's a very important point. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and we have time for questions, so please ask your questions and make your comments. Thanks again.
Is this turned on up? Maybe I don't need the microphone. I would like to thank Professor Stanley Rabinowitz for your talk. If this was a talk given out of the wrong basket, I would really be interested in listening
we can arrange it
from the right basket. I have a question concerning the library, the Gogol library. Is this library anyhow connected maybe to some books which Gogol himself had?
You might know better than I. He must have left.
Was that basically the basis of this library, or
somebody
is it just
founded
the name?
it later?
Founded in the beginning of the 20th century by the organization. It was the library that was collected during the 19th century, but at the beginning of the 20th century was founded a society, Russian society. There was the Russian society founded by the white Russian was Tolstoy, was the Gogol library. At the same time, the SRE founded another library, was the Herzen Society and Tolstoy Library. But the second one is disappeared. There was also a representative of the Russian Academy, Professor Shmurlo, who collected a fantastic library collection of books about Russian history and so on. But this collection is now disappeared, so it's lost. Now the collection of Gogol collection is at the Nationally Library of Rome. There were several attempts by the Russian the Russian official representative to have back, to get back
I'm sure.
the library to Russia. It was at the if I remember, it was the beginning of the new century, or at the end of the 20th century, but the Italian part didn't accept any proposal of this kind, and so but there is not only the library, but the archives of the Russian society. And this is very interesting because it is possible to have a general view about the life of the Russian immigration during from the beginning of the century up to the middle 20s, because during the first years of Soviet power. In Rome, there was the representative of the old Russia, the diplomacy of the old Russia, and they remain up to 26, 27. Then there was a representative whose name was Persiani, another Zabello, and they went to Belgrade because Belgrade was the center of the white conservative forces of Russian immigration. More questions?
Oh yes, thank you. Yes, one thing that Stanley brought up that I was interested in when he was talking about, say, Nabokov in Berlin or the Paris emigration was the question of how whether there was a sort of very tight-knit Russian emigre or Jewish emigre that didn't have too much to do with the Italians, that had this sort of separate society, and to what degree they really did assimilate. I mean, my impression from your talk is that there was quite a lot of assimilation, but also sort of related to that, the sort of Russian Jewish emigration and the general Russian emigration in Italy and how much interaction they had.
There are several examples. For the revolutionaries, of course, and the representative of political parties, we collaborated with Italian revolutionary socialist, and there was a very strong tradition in the 19th century because in Italy there was a very strong movement of anarchism. As you know, Bakunin lived in Italy for several years and organized Comuna and so on. About this, there is a famous novel by Riccardo Bacchelli, whose title is Il Diavolo Pontelungo, Devil at Pontelungo. Is a place where Bakunin organized his Comuna. And so there I think the revolutionaries assimilated, but on the other side they continuously traveled. They lived they lived in Genoa later, and then they went to Switzerland, then back all to Germany and so on. As you know, there were several projects and several important conferences that were organized. The famous school of Capri, the school organized by Bogdanov and Lunacharsky and Gorky and so on. On the other hand, there is Italy, and the Italian language was well known by the musicians. I didn't speak about this, but there are several musicians, not only at the beginning, but during all the century. But for the musicians and for the people of theater, is a bit different, because usually they traveled a lot, and so they live in Italy. Then they have concerts all over the world, and but there weren't any problem of assimilation. Also for the singers and so on, the traditional Italian opera and so on. But what is very interesting, I think that there are several attempts to become writers in Italian. That is, and perhaps the reason is that they could not find readers in Russia, in Italy. There was not such a milieu like in Paris, Berlin, or also in Prague. And so they try for having readers for selling books, and so they were forced to write in Italian. On the other hand, there were several, in the case of Stille, there were several representatives of Jewish Russia of the second generation, and the father perhaps, or the old representative of the family were not assimilated, but the young people were assimilated. And at the end, we have also the students, many students in the university, and they have to study Italian and to speak Italian.
Just one quick response to you, Edie, and that is your question about what might have been and what was the relationship or the dynamics between the third wave of Russian Jews and the Russians who were living there. It's unfair to extrapolate from one example, but I'll give you the example. And it fits in very well with this whole business of Russians invading non-Russian space. The very famous French diplomat in the 1880s, de Vauguier, wrote a wonderful book called Le Roman Russe, and in his chapter on Dostoevsky, he talks about the Scythians are coming. The Scythians are coming. It's Dostoevsky. He'd never seen anything like it. Of course, when the Ballet Russe came to Paris, the French had never seen anything like it. They just were baffled, Well, here is a quote from the director of this very small operation, the Gogol Library in Rome. I could read it in Russian, but most of you probably don't speak Russian. He writes to Mr. Whitney, you can imagine what difficult work we are facing, we 4 workers at the library, in order to to keep in order this mass. The Scythians are coming, mostly poorly educated and undisciplined. Malavas-Spitin, my sense is these white Russians are living, it's almost like this could have happened among Jews. If you see the film, Il Giardino dei Finzi Contini, the garden, these upper class Jews living high with their tennis, they didn't know what was going on. These were my people, rough Lithuanian Polacks. They were, and this is almost an analogy. These white Russians, you can imagine, are living these very peaceful life in Italy, very cultured, and suddenly these masses of, so the dynamics would be, of course, fascinating in any culture, but Italy seems to be nice because it's small and it could serve as a nice laboratory. Anyway, this man had a question, so I should yield to him.
Yes, thank you. My question is on the other side, to what extent these émigrés were Jewish? Did they consider themselves as Jews? Of course, we cannot make a generalization. Did they, the first wave at least, did they speak Yiddish? Did they have any link to religiosity or knowledge or anything like that? Thank you. Thank you for your lecture.
We have several examples of people, Russian Jews, who continue to have relationships with the Jewish milieu, and with, for example, the tradition, language tradition, Yiddish, and so on. But it depends. For example, all the representative revolutionary movement in Italy were not linked to the Bund, to the Hebrew June, and so they were assimilated by the international revolutionary movement. On the other end, we have some representative of Zionism, and especially Zhabotinsky, but not only. And of course, these representatives of Zionism were linked, have a very strict relationships with the Jewish milieu and with the life of Jews in the synagogue and so on. I think that this is a thing that have to be studied more, because usually in Italy now the studies about Jews are very extended, very developed, but not about the Russian Jews. Usually my colleagues studied the period before, the history of Judaism in Italy, starting from the medieval, the Middle Age, and so on. It is necessary also to underline the following case. After the revolution, all the representatives of the people of the Russian Empire decided to organize the national organization or movement. For example, we have a very important diaspora of Armenian in Italy, or Ukrainian in Italy, or there was also representative of Estonian and of Lithuanian, and so on. And for example, they published newspapers and book and so on. We don't have a special say movement, a Jewish movement, but we have, for example, what I recall today, the organization of Leone Carpi, and it was very strong in Italy, the movement of the revisionism, of the revisionist Zionism, and I think for many years it was supported also by the power of Mussolini, because this is very interesting, to the attitude of Mussolini to Jews. It's very strange, and for example, there were several representatives of Jewish milieu who joined the Fascist Party. And there are several Jews who were important representative of the movement, especially in the 20s. We know also that the biographer of Mussolini was Margherita Sarfatti, a Jewish journalist who wrote a very important biography of him, and so on. So as long as it concerned the Jews, there was not a special national movement, but there was an evident stream in the Zionism. This is the revisionism of Zionism.
Just make a very obvious point. Perhaps you know this, but just I hate to point out the obvious. But basically, of course, a Jew from Eastern Europe coming to Italy and trying to integrate into services in Italian synagogues would struggle a bit because the Sidurim were entirely different. It was not at all the tradition, liturgical tradition that they were used to in Eastern European synagogues, in Russian synagogues. In fact, just to jump ahead, in the 1960s, when the last Lubavitcher Rebbe starts sending emissaries abroad, he actually sends emissaries to major Italian cities. And I don't know if you know this, the current head rabbi of Russia on the Chabad Lubavitch end, Beryl Lazar, was born in Milan to parents who were in the first crop of representatives of the emissaries that the late Rebbe sent to all over Europe, specifically to set up Chabad houses, because those traditions had previously been virtually absent. It's just an important point in this context. So if you read about today's chief rabbi of Russia, Beryl Lazar, one of the first things you find out is that he was born in Milan. Why Milan? It's because his parents were sent there from Crown Heights by the late Rebbe to set up house. That's just a small fact, but I think it just shows you that there was a certain discontinuity that had to be compensated for. Yeah, so I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
I just was really curious why Jews returned to Italy after the October Revolution. You had written in your talk that Jews returned to Italy. They had gone to, from what I understand, they had gone back to the Russia, and then they came back to Italy after
Because in 1913 there was an amnesty for the 300 years of the Romanov. And so many representatives of the diaspora had the opportunity to come back to Russia. After that, many of them joined the SRI, or the parties who were thrown by the Bolsheviks. And so they was forced to come back, and they decided to come back to Italy, where they have a milieu, and they can. But many of them in 22, 23, or 24 were forced to leave Italy after the victory of Mussolini, of course. This is the cases of Slonim. Slonim studied in Florence. Then he came back to Russia. He was elected in the assembly. Then he took part to the civil war, and then he came back to Italy after the victory of the Bolshevism in 1920. He lived in Italy some years, but then he decided to emigrate to Prague. It is interesting to underline that Mussolini invited Slonim to write for Il Giornale d'Italia, the journal of fascism, and but Slonim didn't want to do such a thing, and he immigrated and he left Italy. Mussolini told him that no, we are not a conservatory party, we are a revolutionary party, so you can write for us. But because of course Mussolini, as you know, before the war was a representative of the Socialist Party. He was a socialist, and also after the victory of fascism, there was the expression where it was used, the expression l'Italia fascista e proletaria. Поэтому были какие-то странные Сочетание.
Yeah. Well, I think it's time for us to thank Professor Garzonio and Professor Rabinovitz again. Thanks so much, and please come again next month for Elandea Proffer's talk. Thank you very much.
Good.